properties are perfectly suitable for treating their own sewerage on site. Okay? There's a small percentage, 10% or so, that are not. Preliminary needs analysis, we looked at 21 study areas based on a series of criteria, primarily technical criteria, soil morphology on site, depth of groundwater from base of system. From being on the Board of Health for 22 years, that is the most critical item when you're treating septic on site. Via on-site disposal is the base of the system needs to be a certain distance above the groundwater table for obvious reasons. And we screened 9 study areas, street-by-street basis, looked at Board of Health records, received cooperation from the town health agent, Martin Fair, who's been here for longer than I've been on the board, so he knows the properties certainly better than anyone. And we identified 101 streets in those areas that needed off-site solutions. In other words, where treatment on site was going to be a challenge. Next slide. We identified 3 collection areas. Certainly, these were the ones I pointed out to you on the prior slide. This is the West Village area along Concord Street, Route 28 up to the north, as you can see, the Martins Pond area and the properties around that, and then a town center area with properties around that were identified as the higher priority properties. This doesn't mean there aren't other properties in town that also have difficulty treating on site. For any of you those that have driven along Elm Street lately, where my house is by Willow Street, you'll see a lot of raised systems, and those properties are not being recommended for inclusion into this first sewerage treatment system, but nonetheless they do have difficulty treating, and if you want to put in a new system or upgrade, you're going to have to be going above ground. Next slide. This basically shows all of the properties in town that we looked at, and we identified about 2,900 that were suitable with on-site solutions, and then a small percentage in Martins Pond, Route 28, Town Center, and the West Village area that were candidates for off-site treatment. Next slide. Here's a little more detail. Those of you that are in the room, and I know there's many of you in the room tonight from Martins Pond, this is probably nothing new to you, but small lots, rapid percolation rates, meaning that the water doesn't stay in the soils very long to allow for biological treatment, and the potential impacts on not only the aquifer but the pond and its water quality. Therefore, there's a lot of unusual systems up at Martins Pond. We won't go into those. We've given many variances up at Martins Pond for upgrades over the 22 years I've been on the Board of Health, and all of those were necessary. None of them were frivolous. And the reason being, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get a Title V system completely in the ground that doesn't require any variances. I don't think it's very easy to do up there. So that's why it's one of the high priority areas, and also with respect to environmental consequences from the water quality in the pond, and I won't go into those. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. Route 28 and Concord Street, a lot of our commercial properties along Route 28 have replaced systems many times in the last 10 or 20 years. Many of those properties, such as Walmart, the old Shaw's, prior used to be the Atlantic, Horseshoe, it just goes on and on. Those are not the only ones, but many of those folks have had to replace their systems, and because of depth of the groundwater, because of the morphology on those sites and the proximity to the Ipswich River, they really can't treat by on-site. Walmart, for example, wants to expand and bring in more commercial tax-paying, property, people that they can lease to, but because of the implications of the system, they can't do that. And then the town center area, for many of those of you that are familiar with the schools and the town public meetings, we've replaced those systems a number of times. I think the bat shelter alone, I've seen replaced 3 times that I know in the 22 years I've been in town, perhaps 4. Next slide, please. Why are we doing this now? Why are we here now? This is probably the most important theme to emphasize tonight, and the most important thing for everybody to bring away, that this is not just us frivolously saying we want to be done with this. We want to recommend a plan. It's because there's a lot of things that are in place that were planned, but also a lot of things that coincidentally, opportunities that have presented themselves to us that we want to take advantage of. So timing is everything. For example, as Dave pointed out, we've missed opportunities with South Sussex MWRA, federal and state grants. There was a time back in the day when the federal government gave you 90 cents on the dollar to put in a sewage treatment plant. Nice federal government, but those days are gone. They don't give anything anymore. High rate of known system failures and poor soil conditions along 28. And these are just some of the properties that are currently compromised or stressed because of on-site sewage. The postal facility being one, Walmart being another, North Reading Plaza, yada, yada, so on. Town needs, this town schools, in the event that we replace the middle school under the high school in the future, those systems are going to have to be replaced. They'll be expensive to replace if they go to on-site sewage. If there's a system available, a treatment plant, that can handle their capacity, then that cost does not become really a major part of the actual monies needed to construct those systems. It'll already be there. Next slide, please. Work is underway. For those of you familiar with the Lincoln properties across from Benevento Quarry, how many people know what I'm talking about? Those houses that are going up for rent, I believe. They have their own treatment system. As part of their agreement for getting that project in our cooperation, they basically have given us a treatment field. They've given us some money, and that money's been used to some extent already to put piping in the ground. We have piping in the ground already because it was most cost effective to do it when the ground was dug up and the project was in progress than to do it later on. So we've got piping in the ground. In the event that the other side of that property is developed, which is the Gutierrez property, which they're looking for a commercial client, in the event that that is developed, he could become one of our major first commercial clients for this new treatment system. So we could have a client already in hand if this system is ready. Tax base, if you build it, they will come, as Dave said. The hope is down the road to try and change to the extent that we can with an infrastructure like this. This is just the beginning, the mix of commercial versus residential properties, and hence the mix between the tax bases come from commercial properties versus residential properties. Without the infrastructure, we can't do it. Next slide, please. The recommended plan is a wastewater treatment facility. It's adjacent to our water treatment plant, our groundwater drinking water treatment plant, south of the Berry site. The acquisition of New England Power Company land, I believe, has already taken place, and the papers are eminent. Mark, is that correct? That's correct. That's correct. And that money was also from the money given to us by Lincoln Properties. With a design flow capacity of 350,000 gallons per day, to give you some sense of perspective, the Deer Island treatment plant handles 600 million gallons a day of sewage, so this is a relatively small plant. The average house, Title V system, is a couple of hundred gallons a day. So it's not a huge system, but on the other hand, it's not a small system either. The treated effluent will be discharged to groundwater on the Berry site in the field that has already been assigned to us, and the DPW site, which is town-owned. Additional discharge sites we are in the process of trying to identify. As I mentioned, there are other properties in town that are compromised, that are not going to be part of this first system, but the quest continues to find other properties that can handle those as well. Construct a new system to handle Martin's Pond, Route 28, Concord Street, and Town Center. Requires about 78,000 feet of gravity and pressure sewer mains, pump stations, etc. Eventually will serve approximately 1,100 properties. And that's not like 1,100 residential properties. Commercial properties are treated as multiple residential properties. We call them EDUs, or effluent discharge units. So approximately 1,100 of those will be handled by this system. Next slide. This is an aerial photograph to give you some perspective, because maps don't usually do justice to this sort of thing. Here's Martin's Pond from the aerial photograph. This is the Berry site along 62. Here is the DPW site, Town Center, West Village. Basically, to give you an illustration of where the discharge will be. And we now have basically got all of these properties. The acquisition of the NEPCO property gives us a contiguous piece of property all the way from Route 62 at the Berry site all the way down to 28. So that's that. The pieces of the puzzle are in place. So that's the why now, and the timing is very important. Next slide. Town facilities to be served include town hall, middle schools, eventual high school, middle school, new schools, or if the systems that are there now go into failure where they need to be replaced, and this treatment system is online and ready, that would handle the discharge from the existing school systems. Town facilities represent a flow of 3% of the total flow, or 45 of those EDUs, and they represent a project cost of about $1.1 million. Next slide. And now for the costing side of this, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Clark, who's been working with the committee as well as Dave for the last 6 years in coming up with this plan. Mark?
Thank you, Gary. One of the questions we've been asked almost from day one is, how much is this system going to cost? Am I going to get served, and when is it going to be online, and when it does get online? As Gary mentioned, we've dealt with this for over 6 years, trying to come to grips with the entire issue. And to give you the quick cost breakdown, we're looking at about $11 million to construct the collection system, another $6 million for transmission system, treatment plant, and the discharge field, about $10 million, and then what we're calling engineering, land acquisition, and contingencies, another $12 million. Gets us up to the $40+ million of the entire project. As Gary mentioned, the Barry developers, the Lincoln property gave us $750,000. The Gutierrez is on tap to give us another 3/4. So there's $1.5 million in existing funding. Deduct that from the 40, and you're left with about 38, almost $39 million. As Gary mentioned, in the 70s, when the Clean Water Act came out, there was, between the state and the federal government, about 90% grant money to do these type of systems. That's long gone at this point. The only true opportunity we have at this point that's of any significant magnitude is the state revolving fund. When we did the planning part of this, the state revolving fund was a 0% interest loan, which they consider to be about a 50% grant equivalent. It's currently 2%. What we apply for today, we can get a low interest rate of 2%, which they equate to about a grant equivalent of about 25%. Some of the small, about 10% of the cost here is not eligible for state revolving funds, so it would have to be at whatever rate the town could borrow money, but that's a quick breakdown of the cost. Just a quick who benefits and who pays. Gary mentioned the business community increasing property values. Obviously, those of you who have systems that have problems would benefit, and then the town as a whole would benefit. The same group would be looking to pay the cost for it. The Wastewater Committee looked at a number of different options in terms of splitting out the costs. We have properties that we call bettered properties. Those are properties that would eventually receive sewer. You saw our collection system map earlier. There's also a board of it over here. I know it's very difficult to see from the back, but I'd invite anyone to come up and see it if you don't have the opportunity tonight. It is in Town Hall if you come by the DPW office, and you can take a look. But it's basically less than a quarter of the town is getting sewer. The Martins Pond, Route 28 area, the Concord Street, West Village area, and the town center area. How do we split the cost between those properties being bettered with sewer and those properties that don't receive a betterment? And we looked at everything from a 50-50 split, just divide it right down the middle, to 100% zero split, where the town basically has no stake in it, other than, as Gary mentioned, about 3% of the flow is the town flow. We looked a little closer at 3 different split levels. 5842 basically looks at the cost of the collection and the treatment system, assigns that to a town betterment, and then the remainder of the costs are picked up by the people actually being serviced by the system. 75%, 25% betterment, and again an 80-20 betterment. These are the two that we spent a lot of time going back and forth on. The committee actually settled on the 80%, 20% betterment. I'll just step through that real quickly. At 80% of that $38 million cost, or $39 million that's left, that leaves about $31 million to be paid by betterments. EDUs, equivalent dwelling units, would be a single EDU would be a single-family home. If a business had 10 times the water demand of a single-family home, they would be assigned 10 EDUs under this proposal, and their share of the cost would be 10 times that of a single-family home. If it had 20, it would be proportioned the same way. So if we divide the total betterment by the number of EDUs being served, it works out to about, under the 80-20 split, about almost $20,000 per EDU. That would be the betterment cost to the single-family homeowner. The difference between the 80% and the $38 million is the $8 million that's left. That's the amount that would be paid by taxes. The 3% of the local share, that 2.9% of the flow, represents another $900,000. Total tax share is about $8.7 million. So again, based on the 6 years of study, the committee is recommending the 80% betterment, 20% to taxes. How did we get to that number? A couple couple different factors factored into it. What is the cost